Halloween night came, and like every year, the neighborhood kids gathered at our house for trick-or-treating. My dad had set up the scarecrow at the entrance to the cornfield, towering over us like some twisted guardian of the crops. Its eyes, hollow and dark, were carved into the pumpkin head, and the grin was stretched too wide, almost mocking. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that had been growing inside me for weeks, but as the night went on, that feeling became impossible to shake. While my friends laughed and compared candy, my gaze kept drifting back to the scarecrow. No matter where I stood, I always felt like its empty eyes were fixed on me, following my every move. At some point during the night, I noticed something strange. The scarecrow seemed different. It wasn't obvious at first, but I swore it had shifted positions. Its head, once slightly tilted to the left, now pointed straight toward the house. I tried to laugh it off as the wind, but when I mentioned it to my friends, they just teased me for being paranoid, but I couldn't let it go. Later, when most of the kids had gone home, my best friend Sam and I decided to explore the cornfield, just for fun. It had become a tradition for us to scare each other by wandering through the tall stalks late at night, telling ghost stories. But this time, as we approached the field, stopped dead in my tracks. The scarecrow was gone. I stared at the empty spot where it had been standing just hours before, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's got to be a prank," Sam said, but even his voice wavered. We both knew no one had touched that scarecrow all night. As we stood there, trying to make sense of what was happening, a noise echoed from deep within the cornfield, a rustling sound, like something moving between the stalks. Sam turned. To me, his face pale in the moonlight. "We should go," he whispered. But before we could take a step, something moved at the edge of the field. The scarecrow was standing there, just barely visible in the shadows, its pumpkin head cocked to one side, and it was closer than before. My breath caught in my throat. Sam and I stood frozen, staring at the scarecrow. It wasn't where it was supposed to be. We both knew that, but neither of us dared to say it out. Loud, its pumpkin head was tilted at a sharp angle, as if it were observing us. The rustling grew louder, the sound of something, or someone, moving through the corn. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe some prankster had moved it. But deep down, I knew there was no wind, and no one had been near that scarecrow all night. Sam grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Let's get out of here," he muttered. But before we could turn, the scarecrow moved again. This time we saw it. The slow, jerky movement of its legs, stiff with straw, dragging across the dirt. The pumpkin head tilted further, and I swore I saw its grin widen, like it was mocking us, daring us to come closer. But that wasn't the worst part. The scarecrow raised one of its arms. It was no longer just a decoration. It was moving, slow, deliberate, and it was coming straight toward us. Panic surged through me, and Sam let out a strangled cry as we bolted back toward the house. My heart pounded in my chest, my legs trembling as I pushed through the tall corn, the stalks scratching at my arms. Behind us, I could hear it, the dragging, the rustling. It was following us. We stumbled out of the field, gasping for breath, and slammed the door behind us. For a moment, everything was silent. The only sound was our ragged breathing. But we both. I knew we hadn't imagined it. The scarecrow had moved. It had chased us just when I thought it was over. Sam looked out the window. His face went pale and he pointed shakily. It's still out there." I turned to see what he was talking about, and my stomach dropped. The scarecrow stood right at the edge of the cornfield, closer to the house than ever before, its twisted grin glaring back at us through the darkness. And then it took another step forward. We didn't wait to see what happened next. Sam and I backed away from the window, our hearts pounding, fear gnawing at us from every corner of the room. The scarecrow was still out there, inching closer with each passing second. We needed to do something, anything, but all we could think to do was lock the doors and windows as if that would keep it out. We barricaded ourselves in the living room, grabbing whatever we could to block the door. The minutes dragged on like hours, the tension in the air so thick it was suffocating. Every now and then, we'd hear that rustling sound again, followed by what I could only describe as the faintest echo of laughter, like someone, or something, was amused by our fear. And then silence. We waited breathless, our ears straining for any sign of movement. Nothing. Maybe it had left. Maybe the nightmare was finally over. Sam and I exchanged nervous glances, neither of us brave enough to look outside, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I approached the window, peeking out from behind the curtains. My heart skipped a beat. The scarecrow was gone. There was no sign of it anywhere. The edge of the cornfield stood undisturbed, as if nothing had happened at all. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The next morning, when daylight finally broke, we went outside to check. The scarecrow had returned to its spot in the field, standing tall and still, as if it had never moved at all. But the footprints in the dirt, our footprints, along with deep, heavy marks from something dragging, were the only evidence that what we had seen was real. We never spoke of that night again. Sam refused to come over after that, and my dad tore down the scarecrow the very next day, burning it to ash in the backyard. But even though the scarecrow is gone, the memory of that night haunts me to this day, every Halloween. I swear I can still hear that rustling sound outside, just beyond the edge of the cornfield. And sometimes, if I listen closely enough, I hear the faintest whisper of laughter. Story 2. I never believed in ghost stories, not until the Halloween party. It was supposed to be just another night of fun, a chance to dress up, drink, and forget about real life for a few hours. But instead, that night turned into something much darker, something that I still can't fully explain. The party was held in an old mansion on the outskirts of town. The place had a reputation. Sure, but nobody took it seriously. It was just a local legend. Rumors of the house being haunted, of strange occurrences and disappearances over the years, nothing more than stories to scare the neighborhood kids. But from the moment I stepped through those massive creaky doors, I felt it. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. The music and laughter seemed distant, like they were coming from the other end of a long tunnel. And then I saw him, a man dressed in a long black coat, standing in the far corner of the room, his face completely smooth and featureless, no eyes, no mouth, just nothing. At first, I thought it was just a costume, but as the night wore on, I realized this was something far worse, much worse. I tried to shake it off, convinced it was just my imagination. After all, it was Halloween. People go all out with their costumes, right? But as the night dragged on, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about that faceless figure standing silently in the corner of the room. I lost sight of him for a while as the party swelled with more people, laughter filling the mansion's grand hall. I mingled, drank, tried to join in the fun, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, searching for him in the crowd. He was always just on the edge of my vision, standing too still, too quiet. Every time I looked back, he seemed closer. I asked a few people about him, if anyone knew who he was, or if they'd seen him, but nobody seemed to notice. "It's a party, relax," someone said with a grin. But I couldn't relax. I felt like I was being watched, and not by the other party-goers. As the night wore on, things started to get stranger. It was subtle at first, whispers in the corners, lights flickering like they were struggling to stay on. The music began to distort, the voices around me warping into low murmurs. My head felt fuzzy, like the air was too thick, like the room was slowly closing in on me. And then, in the midst of all the noise, I saw him again. This time, he was standing at the edge of the dance floor, completely still, surrounded by the swirling crowd. Yet no one seemed to notice him. His face, if you could even call it that, was turned toward me. I couldn't move, my body was frozen, as if he had somehow trapped me in that moment. He tilted his head slightly, and for the briefest second, I swore I saw a flicker of something. Movement beneath the smooth surface of where his eyes should have been. It was like a shadow shifting, as if something was alive underneath trying to push through. I blinked and he was gone. I felt the room spinning as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out of that house, but my legs refused to move. It was as if the very air around me was holding me in place, trapping me in the growing nightmare. I pushed through the crowd, trying to find someone, anyone, who could see what I was seeing, but their faces blurred together, distorted by the flickering lights. Suddenly, the music stopped. Complete silence fell over the room. I froze. It felt like time had come to a halt, as if the entire party had been suspended in midair. Slowly, almost mechanically, the crowd began to part. At first, I couldn't understand what was happening, but then I saw him, the faceless man. He stood in the middle of the room now, perfectly still, his head slightly tilted as if he were studying us, examining us, the crowd. They didn't react. They didn't even seem to notice him, but I did. My heart pounded in my chest as his presence seemed to pull all the oxygen out of the room, leaving me gasping for breath. Without thinking, I stepped backward, desperate to get away. But the moment I did, his head snapped in my direction, locking onto me. The featureless, smooth surface of his face seemed to ripple, like something was shifting just beneath the skin. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though I had made a terrible mistake. I turned to run, but the second I did, the doors to the mansion slammed shut with a deafening bang. The windows rattled, the lights dimmed, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. I could feel him getting closer. Even though I wasn't looking, I could feel him. His presence pressing in on me from every direction, suffocating me with fear. I stumbled through the house, tripping over furniture, pushing past the people who didn't seem to notice. What was happening? Panic took over. My legs moved on their own, carrying me deeper into the darkened halls. Behind me, the soft shuffle of footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, like he was enjoying the chase. I reached the grand staircase and turned to face the room below, my chest heaving with terror. And there he was, standing at the bottom of the stairs, his head tilted up toward me. He lifted one hand, and I saw his fingers. Long, unnaturally thin, like they weren't human at all. They stretched out toward me, beckoning me closer even as my body screamed to run. For a moment, I was paralyzed by his gaze, his faceless, terrifying gaze. Then I ran up the stairs, deeper into the mansion, the walls closing in around me, the darkness growing thicker with every step. But no matter how far I went, I could hear him, his footsteps, slow and steady, following me. And then, everything went silent again. I stopped, gasping for air, too terrified to look behind me, but I could feel it. He was right there, standing just a breath away. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. My body was trembling, every muscle locked in place, but I knew. He was right behind me, the faceless man, his presence looming over me, waiting for me to make the next move. I forced myself to look, my breath catching in my throat, but when I turned, there was nothing. The hallway was empty for a moment. I stood there trying to calm the wild beating of my heart, telling myself it had all been in my head. Maybe the mansion's eerie atmosphere had gotten to me. Maybe the alcohol and the strange whispers had blended together, making me see things. But just as I started to relax, a cold breath brushed against the back of my neck, freezing me in place. I spun around again, this time faster, and I saw him. The faceless man was standing at the end of the hallway just a few feet away, closer than ever before. His head tilted slightly, the smooth, featureless surface of his face reflecting the dim light from the distant windows. His arm lifted, long fingers curling into a gesture that beckoned me forward. I backed away, my legs weak, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. The air grew colder. my breath coming out in quick, icy clouds. The walls around me seemed to stretch and twist, pulling me toward him. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the sound wouldn't come. It was like the mansion itself was swallowing my voice, and then he took a step forward. That was when I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stumbled through the halls, crashing into doors and furniture. My only thought to escape, to get away from him. The mansion felt endless, its corridors looping back on themselves, trapping me in a maze of fear. Finally, I found the front door. I grabbed the handle, threw it open, and burst outside into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the house, my heart still pounding, the echo of those slow, deliberate footsteps ringing in my ears. I never went back. The next day, when I tried to talk to my friends about it, none of them remembered seeing the faceless man. They laughed, said, "I must have had too much to drink." That I imagined the whole thing, but I know what I saw. I know what followed me through that mansion. And now, every year on Halloween, I feel it again. A presence just behind me, watching, waiting. I'll glance over my shoulder, and for the briefest moment, I swear I see him, standing in the shadows, featureless, motionless, waiting for me to notice him.